All right, greetings, folks. Happy Saturday afternoon, or whatever time it is in whatever part of the world you're in. Uh, so the plan for today, in my first stream, I ended up just talking for 2 hours straight, and last time I think I ended up talking for about close to an hour, and then spent the second half doing some performance debugging. And the goal for today is that I actually basically just dive right into trying to investigate a couple types issues. I'll I'll talk about a little bit about what the context is for the issue itself, but I'm actually hoping to just get right into actually playing around with this. Um, as usual, I will try to mumble and or live narrate my way through the process. Uh, but you may also notice me kind of staring at the screen in silence for large amounts of time as I try to figure out what in the world's actually going on here. Let's see. That's disturbing. The desktop's... Okay, there we go. I think we got the desktop coming through. All right, so the goals for today are to look at a couple of different TypeScript-related issues that have been reported recently. Um, we're going to start with one that's over in Redux Toolkit and specifically related to RTK Query. And if I somehow magically get lucky enough to actually fix that one fast enough, there's a second RTK related types issue that I may look at. And then there's also one over in Reselect that I may end up looking at as well. So, yeah, let's dive right into this. As always, please feel free to actually drop messages over in the chat. Let me know that people are actually still, hopefully, vaguely paying attention here. I'm happy to pause and interrupt and try to respond to questions and do the whole interactive thing. Um, and if not, I'm going to just mumble my way through this for the next couple hours and feel like watching. All right, so the main item for today is that we've had a couple reports that um, the selector generation functions for RTK Query are now producing selectors that cause type errors when you use them by themselves. And this seems to be something new that's happening as of RTK 1.7. And it's unclear whether the specific issue is something that happened inside of RTK Query, or it could also be related to Reselect 4.1, because RTK 1.7 bumped our dependency on Reselect up to a minimum of 4.1.5, I think. So RTK Query endpoints let you generate standard Reselect selector functions that have been pre-generated to pull out the results for a specific endpoint plus input cache key combination. Um, a typical example of this might look like, const select Bulbasaur equals Pokemon API dot endpoints dot get Pokemon dot select Bulbasaur like that, and then later on I can use select Bulbasaur and pull out the results for just that one endpoint plus data combination elsewhere in the code. Let's see, we have a question of, am I going to tackle the issue with um, get default middleware as well? I would like to. Depends on if I manage to solve this other issue first, and also if I feel like maybe moving on to something reselect-ish instead. So what we're seeing here is that people who have been using these generated endpoint selectors outside of the hooks are getting TypeScript errors, and it has something to do with a type that tries to declare where to find the API cache data inside the Redux root state. So we've had 2 or 3 different reports of this. We do have at least one sandbox that demonstrates the issue. And ironically, I actually ran into this myself in my app at work. So clearly this is a thing that needs to be fixed sooner rather than later. Looking at a couple other issues here. That one was I just marked as a duplicate. And this one also has a small reproduction here. So I guess the first thing to do would be, I'm going to go ahead and pull open the sandbox. We'll glance at that there, and then I will probably end up trying to copy this code into one of the RTK test files so that we can play around with that locally. Okay, so where is this actually? Right here. Okay, so sure enough, we have a case where we have a root state. We are generating a selector and passing in a cache key, and TypeScript is not happy with that. And it's eventually saying that an empty object type is missing a bunch of properties from our combined state type, which is not entirely helpful. But fortunately, we've had a couple of these reports that seem to have narrowed down what's actually going on. So the good news is we have a sandbox that replicates this, but I'm going to see if we can put together a more minimal example, and I'm actually going to cheat and see if we have, I think it was this one. Yeah, this one looks like a much more minimal case that we can work with. So I'm going to come over here to our code base and the test suite. And let's see, where would be an appropriate place to put this? Probably in here. So we already have some type tests defined in this test file. All of our Redux libraries have some types specific tests in them. And the idea is not to run the code, but rather to see if things actually continue to compile at the TypeScript level. And we've got those set up different ways in different libraries. I know that for React Redux and for Reselect, we actually have entirely separate files set up just for the type test behavior. Here in RTK Query, we've just sort of been throwing in some additional tests in the same test files, but marking them as skip so that TypeScript will compile them, but they won't actually run when the rest of the types execute. I do find it interesting that we already have at least one type test in here for the selector behavior. But we don't have any failures there. So let's go ahead and add another test here. And what was the issue number? Let's call it issue 1879 for now. And then we'll swipe the code from over here. it's not going to like the export keyword. And for that matter, we do need a state type. For that matter, apparently we're going to need a counter reducer. I'm not convinced that that we actually need a counter slice and counter reducer for this minimal example, but it's also possible that it might be relevant given that there's more than one slice configured for this store. So I'm going to go ahead and create one right now just so there's something actually attached. Let's see. Yeah, whatever. This doesn't matter too much. Turn type. Okay. This is actually a very good sign. Just by pasting this in and getting that set up, we are seeing a replication of the error. This is a really good thing. No matter what you're debugging, first step is always to try to get a replication of the problem so you can verify A, it happens, and B, if we fix this, that it actually goes away. Let's see, probably be a good thing if I actually checked out a new branch. Issue 1879. Okay, so what's the actual error say here? So argument of type bleh is not assignable to root state, parentheses, something counter. Counter is incompatible with index signature. Yeah, that's just lovely. I will also caveat this by saying that my brain does not feel fully locked in today, so it'll be very interesting to see how much actual progress we make during this stream. Okay, so good news is we have an actual reproduction. And the original reporter here thinks that it is likely related to this type here. So let's see where that type's defined. Okay, so we have a file that is part of the RTK query setup that tries to define a bunch of internal TS types. So we've got types in here for things like options you can pass to a subscription, the different combinations of status flags and booleans that can describe a request, some of the internal data types, more internal data types, more internal data types. And so this type down here is supposed to be an internal representation of, we know that once an RTK query API cache reducer has been hooked up to the store, this is intended to represent a root state object containing at least this API cache reducer. Now, in practice, it's going to have a lot of other reducers in there too, but there should be at least this one reducer in there. Where is this even used? A bunch of places, apparently. I will also caveat this by saying that while I've poked around through some of the RTK query portion of the code base, I am very much not an expert on this. Lens Weber has done the vast majority of it. So it's an area of the code base where I sort of know where things are, but I definitely am not an expert on that area. All right. And Matt says, "I believe in you, Mark." Thank you, Matt. Your trust is very reassuring and also possibly unwarranted, but thank you. Okay, so what is this type actually saying? So we're taking in 3 generic arguments. We have the set of endpoint definitions that you laid out in your create API call. We have a set of tag types, which are presumably the tags used for invalidating queries. And then we have a reducer path that is a string. And this is generating a type that says this will be an object, and the key is the reducer path, and the value is the structure of the cache state that an RTK query cache reducer generates. So that part's reasonable, but what seems to be getting messed up is it's like it's looking for more keys than just this one reducer path key. So let's see what this person had to say. So say you've got a store with a slice, and we add the cache reducer. And it will fail because right here, because every reducer path in the store is not of the combined state type. Okay, so the suggestion for this person is perhaps we need pick reducer path root state so it excludes other reducer paths. I'm actually curious how we're ending up with an object that ends up with multiple keys anyway. So what when we actually, whoa, that's not cool. I think it's time to use one of my most used TypeScript commands, which is restart the TypeScript server, because it clearly just choked on whatever's going on here. It's kind of sad that some of my, like if you look at this, some of my most used commands are restart the TypeScript server, reload the window. At work, I was making some changes to our ESLint config, so I was having to continually restart the ESLint server as well. Okay, and hello TypeScript. Are we going to do something useful here? Does not look like it. Okay, reloading the entire window. Matt, how often do you have to reload your TypeScript window or restart the TypeScript server? And Matt says, typically every 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay, this is not a terribly encouraging sign here. Come on, come on. No, that's not working. Okay, what's really weird is clearly TypeScript's choking on stuff, and we're getting any's all over the place, and yet we're also getting that error down there. So none of that makes any sense. Ha, yeah, more comments in the chat saying, yeah, we all just reload VS Code every few minutes. I'm gonna reload this one more time because I'm actually, I suppose the other thing I had to do here, um, let's see what happens if I actually try to run a test against just that one file. Do I actually get useful TypeScript errors here? No, because there are no actual tests that run in that file. Oh, and it also doesn't help that I'm not in the correct folder. We restructured the RTK repo as a mono repo a few months ago because we now have Redux Toolkit itself. We've got the in progress action listener middleware, and there's a couple packages related to code generation for RTK Query as well. And I keep forgetting that I need to be down in the packages/toolkit folder to actually do stuff. But yeah, we aren't going to be able to actually run this right now entirely because there are no runnable tests in this file. Okay, fine. What happens if I add a dummy test in here? What I'm hoping to see is actually like that TypeScript error from that skipped test. Okay, good. That's actually a good sign. So even if VS Code is having some issues here, okay, that's slightly better. Okay, that's a little better. Um, even if VS Code is still kind of choking on this, at least by running it at the command line, I should be able to start seeing some TypeScript problems here. We have a side question in the chat. Is Redux the most popular state handler? Yes, based on all the metrics I have, which are not great, but things like npm downloads and Twitter polls and all that kind of stuff. My rough estimates are that Redux is still used by about 45 to 50% of React apps. That's much, much larger than anything else that's out there. MobX is around 10%. Apollo and React Query are maybe in like the 5-10% range. So Redux being around 45-ish to 50-ish% usage is definitely still the largest and most popular state management library for React at this point. And yes, other comment. They made us use Redux without Toolkit in boot camp. I have, yeah, my apologies. Unfortunately, most courses and stuff out there have not updated to use RTK, which makes me very, very sad. Okay, so we've got a reproduction. We can, and even if VS Code has issues, we can see this failing at the command line. So we've got a starting point to actually try to fix this. So the suggestion here was try doing a pick producer path and root state somewhere. The question is, where would we actually apply something like that? So right now it's actually coming up with an unknown, which is also not terribly great. Um, for that matter, the fact that this is still coming up as any in VS Code is really bothering me. You know, the syntax P in reducer path has me slightly concerned. I don't suppose you can literally just do this, can you? Is that legal? No, no, that's not legal. I'm actually curious how this syntax ends up working. So if I have, I'm just going to play around with this for a minute because I want a better understanding of what that type syntax actually does. What does this actually look like normally? Okay, that seems entirely reasonable. Not necessarily what I would have expected, but that seems to actually work right, which makes sense because this type did work correctly earlier on. So that part seems fine. Okay, really stupid idea. Okay, no particular improvement there. Nope, same problem. Property counter is incompatible with index signature. What's this combined state type, really? Endpoint definitions. Key accent string. User path. Okay, that's just describing the type that a API slice cache reducer returns. So that's really just saying that we expected more cache reducer contents there, and instead we're getting a number from the counter reducer. State blah, never string. So root state, we had our API slice definition. There are no tags, and there's still a string here. Okay, so more specifically, argument of type API counter. I'm seeing this phrase incompatible with index signature here, and I'm still like 98% sure we're talking about a problem at the level of the root state itself. But the fact that there's, in this particular example, there's still a index signature here is bothering me. So we're just going to totally fake this out just because I want to make sure that this type doesn't have anything to do with what we're seeing further down. Yep, same. Okay, so clearly that tweak over here didn't do anything. See if there were any other potentially useful comments in here. So someone else suggested that do p in reducer path, find state, or reducer any, but that seems like a maybe not the best idea. I'm gonna try doing something, and it's probably also very stupid, but we're gonna try this and see what happens. So right now, this again RTKQ internal root state type is saying that it is supposed to be this object structure. What I'm going to try is see, how would I write this? What I want to try and do is a conditional TypeScript check that says what I was half thinking was, okay, seeing if whatever type we're dealing with extends that object. In other words, is it at least this one slice plus something else? But I don't have an actual generic that I can compare this against, I don't think. Extend. Man, it's hard enough trying to think through this stuff when I'm by myself and I can focus and I've got like music blaring. Trying to actually think through this stuff, knowing that other people are watching me is like a whole other different experience. Okay, that's not going anywhere. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, TypeScript has finally decided that it is willing to parse this file. Actually, you know what? That isn't even. Yeah, it is. Let's look at this. What does this think it's supposed to be getting? So we have a giant root state. Okay, purely in the interest of trying to make these things a little more readable, I'm going to come in here and try and hack out a few of these other various lines because I just want to make this stuff readable for now. Obviously, obviously that would cause all kinds of other things to break in practice, but I'm just trying to make this thing a little bit smaller. I'm not sure that's actually making any difference right now. Okay, that's terribly not helping. So the thing that's getting me a bit here is we can tell from this syntax that if we're feeding in a specific string, we should get back an object that has only the one key. See, that part looks fine. Almost makes me start to wonder if this is something going on at the reselect side somehow. Argument of type, API, giant amount of state, counter number, not assignable to parameter of type, root state, giant amount of stuff, which looks the same all the way through. String. And specifically, number is not assignable to type combined state. Yeah, this is the frustrating part of dealing with TypeScript. Like, okay, I can read the error message. I understand that it's telling me that yes, a number is not the same as the type that represents a cache slice contents. What I'm not following is why and how we're getting to that point. All right, you know what? I'm going to punt on this one for now. I'm basically just sitting here staring at it and getting nowhere. I would like to be making progress, but clearly I'm not. So I'm going to set this one aside, and I'm going to have to come back to it some other time. So let's try something different instead. And this is another one that honestly I may not make very much progress on. So you may end up with like another half an hour of me basically staring at my screen and scratching my head. So we've been having a problem where if you happen to specify a function call as part of your configureStore setup on the right-hand side of the object as you're defining the reducer, and you happen to be calling configureStore, using the middleware option and defining the middleware setup at the same time, something is breaking with that process. So my comment from a couple weeks ago, it seems to happen two things together. So function call on the right-hand side and using get default middleware in any way, shape, or form. So I'm just going to punt on all the stuff that I was doing here. We'll stash that for later. And let's try poking at this one instead. So this is 1831. Well, apparently I am consistent because I just tried to create a branch and it looks like I already made a branch with that exact name. Good for me. How wonderful. And apparently that branch is at 8. Made it and then never went anywhere. Has anyone else ever had that experience? Like you make a branch, you go away from it, you come back sometime later, you try to make another branch, and you end up making a branch with the same name because your brain works the same way both times. Okay, so we're going to try and go with a similar setup process. We know that if we have something that looks kind of like this, we can get an error. So step one, let's see if we can reproduce this issue. Let's see, we need a different test file. And it would not be under the query section this time. Probably be, let's put it under, configureStore. And for some reason, when we set up the type test for this file, we never actually... Okay, apparently this is one where we just have a giant file full of actual code, and it's not specifically written using jest. Okay. So I'm gonna... So yes, that does mean we've been very inconsistent in how we've been defining type tests for this. Okay, so I'm going to go borrow that counter slice that I wrote earlier because I'm sure we've got 5 copies of it lying all over the code base already, but I just wrote this one. And that also means we need a copy of slice. And yes, payload action. Stupid ESLint warnings. Okay, so the problem is specifically when we have a call to get default middleware in conjunction with a function being used to generate the reducer object. So I'm going to use one of the little type utilities that we've got floating around here. And where are you defined? Helpers.ts. Let's So with import exact type. Okay, so in a lot of places in our tests, we want to make sure that some variable has a correct type. And so Lens has thrown in a bunch of little helpful utilities that allow you to pass in a variable in some way and also assert at the type level that the type of that variable is exactly a certain thing. So like if I were to fake this out for a second and say that we expect that what we're getting is an object with a field name counter whose value is a string, now this throws a type error because these are a mismatch. But if I say I'm expecting an object with a field called counter that is a number, and I pass in the state, they match, and so it passes okay. So we've got a very basic type check here. And what I want to do is I want to replicate the store setup to where this is generating something bogus. So the issue that we're seeing is that apparently this ends up becoming any. And do we have a type in here? Yes, we have a expect not any type. And just to prove that this throws errors, you can do that. Okay, cool. Okay, so if I manage to replicate this buggy setup correctly, I would hope that both of these two type checks are going to start failing on me. So let's do added that, and the additional trigger seems to be when there is a function call on this side. So what happens if I just wrap this in an object, or wrap this in a function? Oh, no? Okay, no, take it back. That's not what I'm looking for. Can I call it? Nope, that's not legal. Clearly I have no idea what I'm doing here. What if we make this an ify? Nope, that didn't change anything. Were we seeing this with a call to combine reducers in some way? That's sort of better. In fact, let's check this out. So if I remove, okay, we're getting somewhere. Okay, so here we're passing an object directly because configureStore lets us pass the object and it will call combine reducers internally. And if I explicitly call combine reducers, Now we're getting an error down here. Whereas if I do if I call combine reducers separately, it all works. So it's some combination, having a function call on the right side here in conjunction with get default middleware. This is really weird, folks. All right. So part of the question is this related to configureStores types? Or is this related to the get default middleware types? So let's back up. So what type does this think this is? This thinks it is an RTK enhanced store. Any action middleware array. Okay, so the enhanced store type takes state as its first generic argument. And if we mouse over here, these types seem reasonable. So it's by the time we get to configureStore, any, etc. And if we turn off get default middleware, then we see a bunch of counter examples in there. Okay. So this may also be related to the options object that you can pass into configureStore, which also takes a state generic. And has a middleware type that references the state generic. And then there's a curried get default middleware type that has a generic. You know, I think I remember I was playing with this very briefly a couple weeks ago, really not making any progress. So I'm probably not going to spend more than like 15, 20 minutes on this before I hunt on this one too and try something reselect instead. So you notice we have a few places here in the middleware types where we say that state defaults to any. And so part of me would like to know where in this chain, like if when we're getting back a state type of any at the end, where in this chain of middleware behavior is an any entering the pipeline and getting through. So I'm just going to start hacking these up and doing some really weird things to these types to try to get a sense of like, at what point in the process does all this break down? So I'm going to start replacing like any with some hard-coded constant values and figure out where is this actually breaking. Or at least I'm going to try to anyway. configureStore options, any. Okay, that at least did something. For the record, if any of you who are actually watching the stream are thinking to yourself, this seems like just about the most boring stream ever and the most boring activity ever, yeah, pretty much. You're right. Welcome to the life of a Redux maintainer. That's not to say that everything we deal with is this weird and boring, but a lot of it actually is. Okay, so it seems like it's this any that's leaking through down here. That is so weird. As soon as I remove the middleware option, this starts inferring the options. It starts inferring the type of the state from the options. And here it works too. Suggestion from the Peanut Gallery: start a competitive issue fixing league. Nice. I have not entirely jokingly said on Twitter that in for job interviews, instead of having all these, fizz buzz and leak code and logic solving problems and whiteboards and stuff, a real better approach to a job interview would be: here's some code that's actually broken. You have access to Google and GitHub issues search. Go find the comment from 18 months ago buried in an issue that actually has the real answer to why this code is broken, and fix it. And that would be a much more realistic example of what we do at the day job. Okay, so what I think I'm kind of getting out of this behavior right now. So configureStore takes this options object. And while there are generics being applied here, TypeScript is really supposed to figure out what the state is from the type of the options object. And somehow when we have both a function, any kind of a function call here, and the middleware option being supplied, we're ending up with it can't figure out what the state type is from the options, and it's having to fall back to the default generics that are being applied to configureStore. What happens if we cut get default middleware out of the... Ooh. Okay, well, that's even more suspicious. As soon as I cut default middleware out, we go right back to being able to infer this. Okay, so this is starting to tell me that we really are getting, it really is something about the get default middleware types specifically. So let's look at those. So get default middleware takes some options. I don't think we care about those right now. Something bizarre with thunk middleware. Curried get default middleware, which I'm still not sure why. I still don't fully understand that myself either. Get default middleware itself. Actually, that's another question. What happens if we do GDM but pass in an empty array? Okay, what if I go back here and I do that? Okay, so now we have a curry get default middleware any. What happens if I try and convince TypeScript that this is just a general purpose middleware array? Okay, that's not going to make a difference. Okay, so our configureStore options here. Middleware. Get default middleware. Yes. Yeah, as Matt just said over in the chat, this could easily be a thing that takes a ridiculous amount of time to actually diagnose, which is why I'm not going to spend any more than 10 more minutes on it in this stream. For the record, for the record, I'm also planning to cap the stream at 3 o'clock Eastern, so about another 40 minutes total. So I'm going to poke at this for about another 10 minutes, probably not get anywhere, and then jump over and see if we can at least make some progress over on the reselect side, if nothing else. So what we're trying to say here is that in the options for configureStore, you can either pass an array of middleware directly, or it can be a function that gets get default middleware as its argument and returns an array of middleware. It's least that part seems cool. Maybe. So what does it think the type is right here? Dot middleware. It's a middleware. Right now, so we've actually got at the moment we've got we're actually still using TypeScript 4.2. Sorry. Question over in the chat is VS Code using standard TS IntelliSense or the nightly TS extension? We've actually got our repository configured to use TypeScript 4.2, and the reasoning is that way it's actually a little more realistic and helps us catch possible changes to the types that might break on older versions of TypeScript. Now, I could conceivably update TypeScript in here and see if that makes a difference, but at the same time, if this is something that busts with TypeScript 4.2 or 4.1 or whatever, we actually kind of want to know that now. Um, and it's kind of the types level version of developing your web app against the latest MacBook M1 and the latest Chrome when your users are actually on like a 2G connection using an Android phone. It's like just because it works on your machine doesn't mean it's going to work on everyone else's. So we're actually kind of intentionally restricting ourselves on the installed TypeScript version here to try to catch some of that behavior. I mean, the other observation here is that this is a thing that did not happen in 1.6, or at least nobody reported it in 1.6. And the problem is that there have been a couple changes. And now let's see, actually, the reselect changes would have nothing to do with this. It's also possible this was broken with 1.6 and just somehow nobody actually happened to report it. So at the moment, I'm split between this being an actual problem with the types for get default middleware specifically versus something about adding the function here causing TypeScript to no longer be able to pattern match against inferring the types from the options object. And if you're not sure if that made sense, I'm not entirely sure that sentence made sense either. Do we get anything? That's interesting. Okay, I just made a little tweak here to 2 lines of code. So what we had a minute ago was configureStore options takes 3 generics: the state, the actions, and the middleware, and it's falling back to a default middleware type. And then we're also passing the state type down through here so the TS knows what this get default middleware function is. And when I filled in these, I replaced these 3 types with placeholders. Suddenly that's working. And it's still working with that right there. Okay, I'm very slowly starting to narrow this down a little bit. Okay. So I'm starting to come in on get default middleware, or this curried get default middleware as being related. Um, let's see. Let's just confirm a little more. Okay, that doesn't seem to do anything. And neither did that. Well, unfortunately, that still doesn't actually tell me what the information necessarily as much as I would like to know. So it clearly is something going on at the point where we pass a generic argument into curry get default middleware. But that doesn't tell me if the problem is the type that we're getting out of here that we want to pass through, or the behavior inside the curry get default middleware type. Combined reducers definitely knows what type it's dealing with. An object where counter is a number. I will say it is also vaguely possible that this is just a TypeScript problem in the end somehow. Over on the Reselect side, we had a couple bug reports where someone was trying to call create selector, and they were making function calls to generate the input selectors directly. Like it looked something like like they were writing a function that looked kind of like this, and TypeScript was choking on that. And when they moved these out to be separate variables and then passed in those input selectors, that worked fine. So I've been vaguely wondering if there's just some kind of TypeScript related limitation where it's having trouble trying to parse input and functions being called and directly passing their results as arguments or something like that. So it is possible that there's a TypeScript limitation here somehow. All right, well, It's 2:30 Eastern, and so far I am 0 for 2 on the day. I have stared at two different types issues, and I'm not getting anywhere with either of them. And don't even actually have any changes on disk. All right, let's go look at a third one. We've got we have a suggestion over in the chat that it's vaguely possible that there could be something in TypeScript 4.6 which might maybe make that work a little bit better. All right, so let's go look at one more issue, and this time it's over on the Reselect side. So I put out TypeScript Reselect 4.1 in like October-ish, and there were a rapid series of releases where I had to iterate on the types to fix various cases. So 4.1.5 has been out since like mid-November, and there have been a couple issues that have reported cases where it is not working right. Now, the problem is, if you look at this issue, I have been begging the people who have commented in this issue, please, please give me a sandbox or a repo that I think I can look at, or that I can look at to try to figure out what might be going on. And there was one repository someone filed, and I looked at it and said that's not even how you're supposed to use Reselect in the first place. Same thing here. Here, someone at least showed me some potential code, but it's not in the form of a sandbox, so I can't guarantee that I'm going to fully be able to reproduce what their setup is. And then yesterday, someone else was saying, I have the same issue, reverting back to 4.0 works. It's like, okay, that's not helping me debug this issue. So I've been begging these people to give me some actual sandboxes or repos or something that show this actually happening. And then I believe we had same thing in this one. And then there was one more filed a couple days ago where someone said that if you have selectors that have some default values for their parameters, it doesn't work right. And I suspect that we're actually talking about possibly 2 or 3 different problems related from these different issues. So this person did file a PR, and I have really not looked at it, and I don't know if it's complete. But we're going to go poke around for this for a few minutes in the hopes that we can maybe actually salvage something that resembles actual progress out of today's stream. All right, so PR that we've got here at the moment, what does it actually do? We are changing some of the parameter types here. We're ditching a type that doesn't appear to have any more relation. They tried to fiddle with a couple of our type tests, but they wrote a type test. Good. That's a wonderful place to start. Some of the time, if there was a case where I was actually wanting to fiddle with a pull request that someone else has made, I would actually pull it from their own repository. In this case, I think I'd like to just play around with it locally myself. So we're gonna, you know what? I never even saved that file. Let's switch over to Reselect for a while. So I'm going to start by grabbing the example that they wrote here. They dropped it in around line 587. Really? Different file? TypeScript test.ts dropped it in starting at line 587. Oh, because they added something else in here. So we'll just drop it in here and see, do we start getting errors? Okay, so what do we got? We are a fake state type. We are creating selector. 3 different input selectors. Not sure what they're actually trying to show in this part of the test. Okay, what am I supposed to be looking at out of this PR? Okay, that part seems fine. Okay, so the original issue is if an input selector is more than one param, the last one is unknown or any, it's about a number of args mismatch. If a default value is provided without providing a type explicitly, all params are typed as any. Okay, that makes sense. And here we have a parameter with a default value, and magically everything's any. Let's work with those examples. Okay, seeing the same errors that we did in the sandbox, that's generally a good start. So what was this person suggesting we do? If the infer fails for the parameters, falls back to assuming there is no argument, which is the second issue. We have a comment about the get params from selectors type that we were doing that I have in there. And the issue one cause is if remaining items is any or unknown. All right, that's a good question. So let's look at that get params from selectors type for a minute and try and figure out why I added that in the first place. Okay, so a little bit of historical background. The reselect types, the original reselect types are horribly ugly. If we look at this file right here, the original types up through reselect 4.0 were this massive, massive 3,000 long lines file that tried to handle 1 through 12 possible input selectors, either as individual arguments passed to create selector or as an array passed to create selector. And this is just, as you can see, utterly and completely unmaintainable. So with 4.1, I took a new set of TypeScript types that another person had wrote, which tried to ask TypeScript, what is the TypeScript type of input selector 1, input selector 2, input selector 3, and have it infer as much as possible instead. Now, an additional problem here is if you look at some of these types, there's this notion, and even here in the old stuff, there's this notion of a separation between the how many arguments you're passing to the selector function itself. Most of the time, when we use a selector, it's select X state. So we typically pass in the Redux root state as the first argument. Nothing says it has to be that way. Like, I could pass in arg1, arg2, arg3 state and have state be last. I could have state be first and pass in a bunch of additional arguments if I wanted to. Nothing about reselect itself requires that the Redux root state be the first argument. In fact, you don't even have to pass a Redux state value to a selector. It's just that in practice, reselect is normally used with Redux, and 95% of the time, 98% of the time, you're grabbing something out of the Redux state somehow. And so typically, yes, in practice, the first argument is usually the Redux root state. And so if you look at even these old types here, there's this assumption that the first thing you're passing in is going to represent whatever the Redux root state is. And so, actually, can I find the definition of a selector in here so we can see what it looks like? Okay, so the old definition of a selector type is selector is a function that has a state and a result. A parametric selector is something that takes state first. It's labeling a second argument as props, but again, there's no guarantee that this second argument has to be like literally a React props object or anything else. It could even be like a primitive or something. And then potentially takes additional arguments. Well, what we have in the TypeScript types right now is a selector is a function where we're basically treating the first argument special. And again, it's labeled as state here, but it could be anything at all. And for whatever reason, the TypeScript types here are defined to say that we can end up making a selector look like one of two fairly exact function types. Either it's a function that takes one arg and returns a result, or it's a function that takes one arg plus additional arguments and returns a result. And I've actually played around with this type definition some over the last couple months, seeing if there's some simpler way to define it, and I was actually struggling to come up with something that worked exactly. So this person is suggesting that it maybe at least, well, okay, sorry, mixing my thoughts here. So right now we have this get params from selector type and a get state from selectors type. So the basic, the overall process that we're trying to do here is create selector accepts 1+ input selectors as arguments. From there, at the TypeScript level, we're going to ask TypeScript, hey TypeScript, what is the type of input function 1, input function 2, input function 3? And then we want to go through each of those function types and ask TypeScript, what are all the arguments that those input selectors expect? So we've got this larger, we got a type here called extract params, which is going to grab all of the parameters in there. And where does get params from selectors come into play? I mean, to refresh my memory on stuff that I worked on a couple months ago. Okay. So create selector can be used in 2.5 different ways. You can either pass all the input selectors as separate arguments, or you can pass them all as a giant array. And we have a slight variation here that says pass them as inline arguments and passing some additional customization options later. So when we see references in some of this code to get params from selectors or get state from selectors, that's basically saying we're going to grab whatever is the common first argument to all the input selectors, or we're going to grab the common second plus all other arguments to those input selectors. And so the person who reported this is pinpointing this spot in the code as a potential issue right here. And at some point, I wrote a comment here that says this seems to default to an array containing an empty argument, which is not meaningful and causes problems. So when did I add that comment? So I've got a VS Code extension here that will let me step backwards through the history of the file. You can kind of think of it as a fancy version of git blame. So let's see, if I scroll down, will it actually preserve my scroll position each time? Yes, wonderful. So when did I add that? Rewrite selector parameter extraction for correctness. Okay, that's a wonderful comment. The extension name is it's Git File History by Rodrigo Pombo. The extension identifier is pomber.git-file-history. Okay, so let's actually look at what this user put in the PR and try out a couple of these changes and see if this makes any difference. does it play nice with Git lenses? No idea. I think I had the Git lens extension installed. Frankly, I don't use a lot of Git stuff within VS Code itself, so I'm actually not entirely sure. Okay, so we've got one change to this type here. So let's just try, you know what, let's just open this up and copy paste that chunk. Starting line 170. Export interface, create selector function. So we're just going to grab that whole thing. And we're just going to try replacing this with what was in that PR. And then what else got changed? The get params from selector type, we just change it to remaining items. Okay, so I've just copied over the couple changes that were in that PR. Let's go look at the type tests and see how many things are exploding. Okay, well, those changes do appear to be fixing the problems that are in here. So we have here we have a second argument that's unknown. It's an empty object, and I can pass some dummy data to it. This one's not fixed. Okay. So it's a partial improvement. And I do agree that the change right that this change right here, basically that this piece right here doesn't seem to be necessary because it's not doesn't seem to be breaking a whole bunch of other stuff. But on the other hand, we are getting a problem up here now. Type unknown is not assignable to type never. How wonderful. All right. You know what, folks? It's about 8 minutes to 3 o'clock here, and I think my brain is about fried enough on TypeScript types for the day. So I guess we're kind of like 0 for 3. I looked at 3 different TypeScript issues, and I made very little progress on any of them, which is a little bit annoying on a personal level. And so I was really hoping that we could at least fix the problem that was going on with the RTK query selector types, because that's clearly a thing that is broken, and I was hoping to maybe even get a fix out for that today. That didn't happen. This is also kind of disappointing because I was really hoping to show some actual progress happening on this stream, and instead we basically just got me staring at a screen for 2 hours and saying, huh, this is broken, and I don't know why. So probably not, well, definitely not the most interesting stream ever, but this is perhaps fairly realistic in the sense that this is what we spend a lot of our time doing as maintainers these days. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here in a minute. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to toss out over in the chat about anything Redux-ish, whether it be types, usage, something at all? Like any questions you'd like to ask me before I go ahead and kill the stream for the day? Any questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Okay. One question. If Microsoft gave you a job offer to work on TypeScript, would you take it? No, for multiple reasons. Um, One is I'm not not terribly interested in potentially working at Microsoft to begin with, just for a bunch of personal reasons. Another is I really enjoy working on an application as my day job. I've my whole career I've worked on an actual app, or at least something very closely related to an app, and that that scratches the itch of like I need to build something. And in a lot of ways, that's what frees me up to do a lot of this Redux stuff in my free time. The fact that I did get to work on something kind of specific and application like during the day, so that I can do a lot of Redux stuff elsewhere. Uh, Another thing is I am most certainly not qualified to work on TypeScript itself. Um, I've managed to assimilate just enough to be useful working on application code and some on library code, but I am in no way, shape, or form qualified to work on the TypeScript compiler itself. So it's a good question, but the answer is most definitely not. I mean, for that matter, honestly, even if I was offered like double my salary to be a full-time open source Redux maintainer, I wouldn't want to do that either. I want to have a day job where I'm building applications and then do Redux stuff in addition to that. But good question though. Good question. Anybody else? All right. So we'll go ahead and call it here. If and when there probably will be a when I feel like getting around to doing another stream. No, again, no specific date on this, especially because I am doing the job search thing right now, and that's taking up a lot of time and effort. Whenever I get around to doing another stream, I will probably look at the guts of React Redux. I think it would be interesting to talk about the changes we've made between version 7 and version 8, and especially in relation to uh, the new React use sync external store hook that we've rewritten the internals around. Um, so that one would probably be more of a descriptive stream than a Mark stares at code stream. Uh, Other than that, yeah, thank you for the 10 to 12 people who were actually willing to more or less sit there and watch me stare at a screen for 2 hours. Sorry this wasn't more interesting, but it's realistic. So, hope you all enjoy your Saturday. Take care. Have a good weekend.